This morning we are going to be talking about all sorts of brilliant things around BNG and hopefully demystifying some of it, although obviously there remain a few questions, and hopefully building confidence in the path to BNG. We've got some brilliant speakers, and but most importantly, it's actually understanding what you guys want out of today. So this is primarily a farmer and a landowner event today. So we really encourage questions from farmers and landowners that have got their queries on this. And ideally, we will be trying to keep to questions, but if you've got a short, brief comment, we welcome that as well. I've got a couple of things I've got to mention here. Oh yes, of course, farmers produce food, which is fundamental to the survival of nature in a farming landscape. So we want to make sure that we bring this back to food production wherever we can. How BNG fits with food production, not necessarily overlapping everywhere, but potentially overlapping, but how it fits into the landscape and our needs for food production. The other thing I am going to mention is this is not, disappointingly, a surgery of financial advice. This is very much an open question, sharing perspectives and with the experts we've got in the room, identifying some of the routes to these solutions, but this is not advice. I reiterate that, I'm sure we'll hear it again. Get your own financial advice, don't sue us. My name is Tim Field. I am a facilitator of the North East Cotswold Farmer Cluster, which covers the Evenlode and the Windrush. We are just helping the embryo of the Cherwell Valley cluster as well, which is great to see a couple of members here today. There are representatives from lots of other farmer groups, and I'm sure farms that aren't part of farmer groups, but the idea is here very much let's share knowledge and to come up with some of the solutions. It leaves me just to introduce the star of the show today, Matt.
Not the star of the show at all. I'm going to speak very briefly, just because there's two logos up on there, and most of you are probably only familiar with one of those logos. So I'm Matt. I'm the manager of the Oxfordshire Local Nature Partnership. LNPs are all about bringing loads of different types of partner together to get better outcomes for nature, and really interested in innovative approaches to delivering nature recovery and nature-based solutions, funded by the councils of Oxfordshire. But obviously, of those innovative approaches, Biodiversity Net Gain is probably the most immediate and one of the most talked about at the moment, pending the February 12th date. So that's why we've been really pleased to organise this event for you all, and really pleased to do it in partnership with the National Farming Union. So yeah, just wanted to let you know when you see the LNP logo what it is. That's all I need to say. I think on with the meat of the day.
Brilliant. So first speaker from the Trust of Oxfordshire's Environment, Ben Taylor, who is just going to run through what is Biodiversity Net Gain.
Okay, so my name is Ben Taylor, and I work for the Trust of Oxfordshire's Environment, which is a local charity in Oxfordshire. We exist to protect and restore nature across the county. But one of the ways we're doing this is to work with farmers and landowners across the county with Biodiversity Net Gain as a way to help to restore nature in a way which is strategic and joined up. And I've been given the unenviable task of answering the question, what is BNG? And I'm going to do that in a fairly summarised form. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail just because there is a lot of it, and a lot of it is still quite contested and unclear. What I will do is kind of try to paint a picture of some of the big changes that have happened over the last couple of months, and then I think try and give you a sense of where I see some of the opportunities for you as landowners, why you might do BNG and why you might not do BNG, and trying to give a bit of a balanced picture there. So just to kind of skip over some of the details here. Biodiversity Net Gain is a policy kind of comes out of the Environment Act, which was enacted in 2021. And it really and the Environment Act sets into place a number of different policies which are aimed at restoring nature and meeting the UK's international target to restore 30%, to put 30% or to increase, nature by 30% over the next, by 2030. And the Environment Act basically stipulates that most planning applications, not quite all, but most planning applications need to demonstrate a net gain in biodiversity over a 30-year period. And that should be a minimum of 10%. So for all of the biodiversity that you lose, you need to put it back, 100% of that back, plus another plus 10%. And these gains and these losses are measured by a metric, a very highly technical tool which has been put together by Natural England and is often referred to as the DEFRA metric, and the current version being DEFRA version 4. So you'll see metric version 4.0 a lot because that's the statutory version of the metric. And the metric comes alongside a whole set of quite complex rules around what you can and can't do around kind of losses and gains in biodiversity. And so these, for example, incentivise what's called on-site biodiversity net gain, so mitigation of losses on a development site. So the first port of call is that you mitigate your development losses on a development site. And only if you cannot do that should you look for development through a third party, like, for example, a habitat bank on a farm or a land holding. And there are commercial penalties within the metric for going too far away from the site of the loss. So in practice that means going outside of a local planning authority area or outside a national character area. So the further away you do your offset, the more penalties there are to that, although it's not impossible. So this is a grossly oversimplified graphic of what biodiversity net gain does. So you have on the left-hand side there, you have a kind of pre-developed, you have a kind of a nominal, let's call it an arable field. You've got what would be termed low distinctiveness areas in the middle, and then perhaps some slightly nicer scrubby areas around the outside, represented by the nicer from a biodiversity point of view, scrubby areas around the outside represented by the yellow. And you build on part of the land and you lose biodiversity as a result of that, and that's measured in units. And then you have these two options, broad options, which are actually, you can have any number of kind of mixes between these two things, but an on-site provision and an off-site provision. And what I've tried to do here is kind of look at this from a biodiversity point of view, what some of the pros and cons of doing each of those would be. So there's some of the benefits of having biodiversity net gain delivered on-site would be around what's called the mitigation hierarchy. So it's philosophically better to mitigate on a development site than it is to offset somewhere else. And you also get some benefits from the people who are living locally. But delivering off-site can deliver benefits too, in terms of being able to deliver better outcomes for biodiversity, actually, in terms of scale and in terms of connectedness and in terms of strategic location, because it matters where you put biodiversity back. It's a bad idea, for example, to put it back into an area where it's a long way from other sites of value for nature, because the flora and fauna which inhabit that area will be cut off from other populations elsewhere. So there are both pros and cons to both of those different approaches. Just to dig into a little, again, there's a lot of detail here. I don't want to go into a huge amount of detail, but just give you a very broad overview. The metric will assigns a biodiversity unit value to a particular piece of land according to a number of different criteria. So looking obviously at the size of the area that's being gained or lost, looking at the relative importance for biodiversity, so assigning a distinctiveness aspect to it. Looking at the condition, is it in poor, medium, good condition? And and where it is, again, that connectedness with other wildlife sites, other sites, it matters in terms of the metric and the calculation. And again, going back to those trading rules, which are also an important part of this, you cannot destroy high distinctiveness habitat and replace it with lots and lots of low distinctiveness habitat. You have to replace like for like or better. So you can't, for example, destroy lowland deciduous woodland, which is a high distinctiveness habitat, and replace it with lots and lots of low distinctiveness or medium distinctiveness neutral grassland. Here are a few things which have changed recently, which I thought it might be useful to go through in a few more details. So one of the key clarifications that's come out relatively recently is that all BNG sites, all habitat banks which can receive units from developers for offsetting, must be secured legally through either what's called an S106 agreement or through what's called a conservation covenant. And in practice, that means it has to be secured through an S106 agreement, because conservation covenants don't yet exist in actual reality. They're just an idea as we currently stand. So that's a really important point, and I think it's an important key takeaway in terms of what's needed. They are complex and sizable legal documents, and they require a lot of expertise to develop and I think hopefully one of the themes that's going to keep coming up as we go through this is that the importance of seeking the right advice, and one of those areas of advice is legal advice. There are step-by-step guides that have been brought out within the guidance. There are some key templates and tools. There's a new format for what's called a habitat monitoring and management plan, which is a really important keystone of any offset site that you will need to develop if you go down this route. There are some detailed costs and charges that can be applied by local authorities for registering sites, and there's some more detailed process and rules which dictate how you record the flow of units, how you record units which you've sold, how you record units that you're generating on your site. There's also quite a lot of detail, if you like, on the process that one would follow to create an offset and be able to trade units. So this is a very, again, grossly oversimplified version of that process, but hopefully it gives you an idea of where you'd go. So you'd obviously identify a suitable site. You'd calculate how much you could potentially generate on your habitat bank site. You would develop your habitat management and monitoring plan. That's a keystone, and that will become part of your agreement with a local authority, your S106 agreement or your conservation covenant. You draw up those legal agreements, and then and only then can your site go onto the Biodiversity Net Gain National Register, which is the key test which you need to pass in order to buy and sell units and generate financial value from Biodiversity Net Gain. So, and then of course you've got to actually trade units. So you've got to develop a way of accessing this market, and you've also got to monitor and manage your site over a 30-year period, either yourself or through intermediaries, if that's the way you do it. Here's a little bit of where my organisation have come from on this over the last few years. So we got involved in this before the Environment Act came in, and before Biodiversity Net Gain was mandatory. That's given us a bit of experience in doing this in reality, in anger, if you like, and actually delivering Biodiversity Net Gain projects. I'd put a health warning on that, in that working in a pre-mandatory voluntary market is very different from the new world we're working in, where we have obviously a statutory framework to work within. But hopefully some of these will be useful lessons that we have. So we've delivered around 7 projects on around 100 hectares of Oxfordshire, with a series of different landowners, from family farmers through to large estates and NGOs as well. And we've placed around 160 units. And I think, what we feel strongly about this is that if you do biodiversity net gain from a biodiversity point of view, which is obviously we're a conservation charity, we're not a business, it can deliver positive benefits for biodiversity and put nature back in a way that's strategic and joined up and hits all of the buttons which the Environment Act was actually put there to achieve. If you do it right, you can also get it wrong and it can actually not work from that point of view. But from the other side of it, it can also be commercially viable. And I think my passion about this is that it needs to be commercially viable for landowners. Otherwise, it's just not going to happen. So we can be starry-eyed about wanting to restore nature, but unless it's actually going to work from a business point of view and from a commercial point of view, it's not going to work. It's not going to happen. And it's also, aside from being commercially important, it's also a good way of not to spoil a video further down the line, but it can also help you from if you like the shop premises of an agricultural business and putting and soil health and biodiversity and diversification as well. Here's a quick example of a project. This is a made-up one, but it's closely based on some real ones that we've done. So the idea behind this is to kind of make a couple of points really. It doesn't have to be the whole farm, and in fact, I would argue in some ways it perhaps shouldn't be. This is about using land that perhaps might not be that productive or that profitable from a farm business point of view, but could be great for biodiversity and from a creating an uplift point of view. It doesn't have to be one big area. It can be several different areas around the farm. The key thing is who's ultimately signing the legal agreement, but the red line could be a number of different areas. So this site has got a number of different kinds of zones in it. You've got an area of floodplain meadow with some woodland buffer in it. You've got a kind of a bit of scrub barrier between the site and a road. You've got some arable reversion. And you've got some existing woodland which you're making better, you're putting into a better state from a biodiversity point of view. And all of those can generate unit uplift which can then be sold on the biodiversity net gain market. So as an indicative, and please don't take these as gospel, they are an indicative uplift. It will depend very much on the conditions on individual sites and what they look like and how they can deliver. But you've got a kind of arable to medium distinctiveness grassland sort of shift, which is taking on a 1 hectare site is generating a kind of 5 unit uplift. You've got a kind of modified grasslands, pasture land going into high distinctiveness grassland that's giving you a 6 unit per hectare uplift, and you've got a kind of woodland improvement which is giving you about 3 units. They all obviously also all come with a cost. So obviously this is a justifiable focus on the potential commercial gains from biodiversity net gain. There are obviously also input costs. They're obviously very different from agricultural input costs, but they are certainly there. We've tried to, again, these are very indicative. They're based on the market sort of now. The market's, as you very well know, is changing all the time in terms of input costs, but these are some indicative costs on each of those areas over a 30-year period, cost per hectare. And again, emphasising every project is different. This is a range for a reason. It's going to depend very much on the context.
Is that an annual cost?
Yes, I think they are, aren't they?
That's over.
Oh, sorry, that's over the full 30 years. Yeah. I thought I'd just break down some of those. So there's obviously the habitat generation cost, the cost that you would have to put into your land in order to achieve the uplift. But increasingly, there are a lot of other costs associated with a habitat where the biodiversity net gain offsetting that you all need to be aware of as you're assessing this as a viable possibility for your land. And these are increasing as this becomes more complex, more formalised, and everything else. So you have, you have three different phases here. You've got your kind of, if you like, your feasibility work. So what does it cost to get to market? And that's kind of broadly on the left-hand side. So you've got charges from your local planning authority for registering your site and for signing an S106 agreement. You've got registration fees for the Biodiversity Net Gain register. And you've got there's some very complex questions, which again, we won't go into a huge amount of detail on this at this stage, but you might have to come out of existing environmental land management schemes in order to go into biodiversity net gain. So there might be costs in doing that. You've obviously then got your habitat generation costs. And then once you have your habitat bank up and running, there's obviously the management and monitoring costs associated with keeping that going over a 30-year period and meeting your statutory obligations, your legal obligations under your agreements. Just to kind of go into a little bit more detail on those kind of things. Obviously, I don't want to kind of delve into this too far because it's complex. But you do have that it can potentially work alongside other existing schemes. You might have to, the phasing will matter. So you might have to come out of existing schemes, implement your biodiversity net gain, and then potentially move back into areas like countryside stewardship after you have established your habitat bank. I put a few key points down here, and I guess this is kind of the kind of points that I really want you to take away from this. The cost of entry into biodiversity net gain are high, and they're getting higher. And they're probably higher than you might imagine once you start to break it down. That's not to put anyone off, but they are something which you have to look you have to look at this in a very hard-nosed way, and it will. I think this will increase as we go forward. Getting the right advice is obviously therefore really important, and working through intermediary organisations like my own, like Trust for Oxfordshire's Environment, getting advice from the likes of the Wildlife Trust, getting advice from your local farming cluster, for example, will be a really important feature of all of this. Biodiversity net gain won't suit every farm, every farmer and every field. So looking at this from a feasibility point of view, getting that good advice will be really critical. For example, if your site is already really nice from a biodiversity point of view, it's not going to be very good for biodiversity net gain because you need a net gain in biodiversity. It might be great for countryside stewardship, but it probably won't suit biodiversity net gain. A really important, picking up on Tim's point earlier, you can still farm your land, you can still generate food from your land. And I think this kind of dichotomy that's being put out there, that kind of nature restoration and food production are in conflict utterly with each other. I don't agree, and I don't agree that biodiversity net gain is kind of facilitating that you can still produce food off your land. This is a new market. There is risk, and that is something I'd be very keen to kind of emphasise. I would at this stage, I think it makes a huge amount of sense potentially for some farmers as part of a broader diversification strategy. But as a kind of place to put all of your eggs, it's not a great option at this stage because this is a new and emerging market. And that's it from me. Do I have time for any questions, or have I?
You just beat me to writing 0 minutes left.
Okay.
Thanks, Ben. That was an amazing whistle-stop tour through. I've got a query or two, but I think let's put it to the floor. Who's got any questions for Ben on any of the what is BNG? Rose, hold your question until we get that mic over to you. Thank you.
Thanks. Hello, thank you. It's not working. Oh, yes, it is. You mentioned repayment of existing grants. Will it be necessary to repay countryside stewardship grants on those parcels?
So there's no. So I think it's fair to say at the moment the guidance at national level is quite unclear. Looking at my colleague here, who's is much more in the detail of this. It would depend a little bit on what the local authorities decide in terms of the stipulations that they put on habitat bank registration processes. So, for example, I believe Buckinghamshire, for example, stipulated that you needed to sort of if you like, stop and start again in terms of countryside stewardship agreements. But you might, and repay them initially, but then you could, so the key thing is additionality in this is the biodiversity net gain additional to, and what they want to try and avoid is creating biodiversity net gain that's actually being created by something else, by a countryside stewardship agreement or by some other environmental land management scheme. So that the idea is the uplift has got to be generated by the biodiversity net gain and nothing else.
Could I give you a little scenario for that? So you create a floodplain meadow habitat, right? And you get the BNG units for that habitat specifically. If you take that to another level of distinctiveness and complexity, or another unit or two through stewardship, probably doing it the wrong way around here, you can claim the stewardship, but you can't claim the stewardship for creating the initial meadow.
Yeah, it's all about what the option that your land is in was designed to deliver. So for example, if you were in something like GS2, which is low input grassland, and you're turning it to a high distinctiveness habitat, you're doing way over and above the prescriptions and the outcomes that were designed for countryside stewardship. So it may be that the RPA would allow you to then put the same to be paid for BNG, because what you were anticipating creating was not a high distinctiveness grassland. So we've put in you may need to repay grants because that will be at the discretion of the RPA. What you will need to do if you have a countryside stewardship agreement is look at what your option is designed to do and what sort of habitat it is intended to create. So if you are in create species-rich grassland, you would not be able to put BNG on that without coming out of your CS agreement. You may also wish to, if you had, for example, margins or buffers, take those out of your CS agreement. And you would apply for a derogation or to change your agreement. And that would then depend on what the RPA say and being able to prove that what you're doing is separate and additional to what the CS agreement would be doing. So the reason we haven't put lots of examples in there is because it really depends on the option and then speaking to Natural England and to the RPA about how they see those fitting together.
Thanks.
Question along the table?
Yeah, just following on from that. Am I on now? Right, just following on from that. You talked about management options there. What about CapEx options that's been carried out on parcels? Thinking specifically fencing, because that's something there. Is that something that would be looked at site-specific as well?
Capital items are slightly different because if you've been paid to put a fence in, that's got a lifetime, hasn't it? On your BNG agreement, you might need to replace fencing, etc. So capital items are very, very different. You wouldn't need, I don't think, to repay any capital items. Yeah.
So effectively that would be knocked off your BNG agreement costing.
Yeah, when you're looking at, do I need to fence?
Or pond creation or whatever. But it is complex and I suppose case by case. If you'd like to, I reiterate, if you'd like to say who you are and where you're from, do, but you don't have to. Neil, this is a good table, this, full of ideas.
Sorry, we're hogging.
It just works.
It works, yes. Hello, Neil Nicholson here. Nicholson, I'll start the trend. A quick question was on the 10% net gain. Your example at the beginning, you had 14 units to start with. Does that mean you go from 14 to 15.4?
Yes.
Which is your 10%? Yes. Because
wrong.
on your figures you had 6,
Yes.
and I had 6.6. So
we needed to correct that and we didn't have time.
Okay, perfect. So it's 10% of your original
baseline,
count.
Yes.
Spot the finance director.
Thank you.
Yeah. We knew someone would.
Questions from other parts of the room?
That's fine.
Thank you. Brendan Hennigan. I'm looking at 100 acres of grassland and what to do with it. It's not really working, is it? I am new to this. I've heard all this talk about increasing units, but what's the value? I just want a baseline. What is the value of a BNG or whatever unit? Secondly, I am still totally confused by half the terms you're using. I just don't understand them. So I'm probably at the wrong event, but you need a Jack and Jill event for people like me, because I know I'm not the only one that is totally confused by this. I won't get into countryside stewardship with the grants you can have. That's something different. I'm here to understand what you offer, and I am confused.
So my advice would be let's come. We could come and talk to you, or actually any number of us could come if you. So there'll be support. I don't know if you're involved in a farmer cluster.
Yeah.
So your farmer cluster could well be able to provide some advice. I think it would be very hard to run an event where we answer every question because it's just too much detail, to be frank, at the moment. I think this probably works best as a conversation, and I'd say this to everybody. Actually, I think it works best as a conversation. It's highly, as we were saying earlier on, it's so context specific and it's so dependent on the land. It's so giving an answer, for example, on the unit price.
Because you said increase 10% here, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
Well, what's the base value?
Yeah.
What's it worth? What's the 10% going to get you to?
Yeah.
I've seen some of the costs, but
yeah. And I suppose my answer to that is I can't really give you a straight answer to that because it will depend so much on your land.
No,
so
I mean an example, because
unit costs.
I can't see how it's increasing and changing because
Yeah.
I don't know what the baseline. So just give your example of the 5 different bits. I've got 2 of those: scrubland and existing pasture. I'm working out what I do with it.
Yeah.
But if I come to you and say, well, what's the value of this now?
Yeah.
And I increase it by 10%, 30%, whatever. What does it add to the value then?
Yeah, so those kind of unit uplift figures that we were giving earlier on, let's say you generated 6 units from your, I don't know, a floodplain, piece of floodplain meadow, for example, or a piece of pasture that you were turning into a species-rich grassland. Each of those would carry a value, and at the moment, unit values around biodiversity net gain are changing a lot, but you're looking in the sort of between £20,000 and £30,000 per unit in terms of unit prices. But they're very variable, and they will depend on the nature of the habitat that you're ultimately creating at the end of. So a higher distinctiveness habitat will attract a higher price potentially, and actually will potentially be more saleable in terms of the market because lots of developers are looking for high distinctiveness units that might be being lost off a development site. So it will vary a lot in terms of value.
Is this like carbon offset? In the sense that you've got a unit.
It's an offsetting market.
And I'm going to sell it, so I can go and do something over here, and whoever buys it is an investor.
It could have. It's much earlier. It's a much earlier stage market than the carbon market.
Okay, but that's where you're going, by the sound
It's
of it.
probably is where this is going. Yes.
And it's
beginning
mandatory.
to understand.
It's
now.
regulated, so
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's unlike carbon from the point of view. It's so defined in terms of regulation. Yeah.
I think we'll pick up let's simplify this on the panel discussion, because I think there's going to be, you won't be the only one in the room that's thinking that.
I talk
And
to
also
my farmer
pricing.
locals, and they're as confused as anything.
Yeah, so we need,
And we don't have the time to go and read everything. So that's why when you have a seminar, you want to come and get hose pipe. Oh, that's what it means. Right, I can go back and understand the blooming DEFRA documents.
I can give a very simple explanation because maybe they know too much about it. So here we go. As a landowner, you can use your land to create more biodiversity on it. And you can enter into a 30-year agreement which will be charged on your land, and you will be liable to deliver that biodiversity uplift. So you have to make sure that you do that. And in return, they feed what you're doing into a metric, and it pops out with a number of how many of these credits you have created. And the example given was that you might create 5 in 1 hectare of grassland that you are then going to manage to really increase biodiversity in that area, according to your habitat management plan. And at the end of the 30 years, well, during the whole 30 years, that's checked, and you have to pay for monitoring reports. So there's one at year 1, I think there's one at year 3, and is there one at year 5? And it goes on. So you have got a legal obligation, but in return, you are increasing biodiversity on your farm, and getting these valuable metrics that you can sell, these valuable credits, sorry, that you can sell. And at the moment, they're 20 to 30,000 each, say. So on a hectare per unit, you're looking at possibly £100,000, but you're going to turn your maybe former pasture or arable land into something different over 30 years. It will become a nature reserve. And you can still farm it, but you can't just slather on glyphosate. And so it's a long-term plan, and you have all these legal requirements, like habitat monitoring, so that it means something. I understand that. And the 10% is not for you to worry about, it's the developer who has to deliver that.
Let's pick that up in the panel discussion, because we want to keep moving, and I appreciate that we will probably need to take it back to starters, but thank you, Rose, for a quick... Can we pick it up in a second so we keep on time and bring it back at panel, if that's okay? So remember your questions, write them down. So Rohit from the NFU is going to talk us around some of the unanswered questions.
Some of the many. Yeah.
Some of the many unanswered questions, but also fill in some of the blanks as well. So Rohit, over to you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thanks all for joining today. So brief introduction to myself. My name's Rohit Kaushish. I'm the Chief Economist at the NFU. I sit in the Policy Directorate, and I tend to do a lot of work with our climate change team and our environment team, effectively looking at environmental markets, the broad range of them, carbon offsetting, nutrient neutrality, you name it. We're looking at it and we're trying to understand what's the potential for farmers to engage in this in a meaningful way. The conversation used to be very much about how do you drive the demand for these markets, and we've tried to rebalance that and make policymakers, market developers think more about actually how do you support farmers on the supply side of these markets to make it work alongside their farming businesses. I think that was a really valuable intervention, actually. I'd like to do a bit of a show of hands just to know where we are with this. So just by show of hands, who is kind of approaching this and thinking, well, it's all a bit confusing, I'm quite new to it, and I'm here just to kind of get a bit of a feel for this for the first time. There we go. That's really helpful. And who's on the other end, who's kind of getting engaged in some of these kind of agreements and looking to top up your knowledge? A few. And who's in the middle, kind of, familiar, getting comfortable with the concepts? Okay, great. And that's what we normally see. So those who feel like this is all really new, fresh, what's going on here? What are we talking about? How do I make this work on my farm? You're not alone. It's not only farmers and land managers that are in that space. It's professional advisors who are in that space who are still trying to figure out the rules. It's policymakers who are trying to understand how all these fit together, all these different carbon offsets with biodiversity, with nutrient neutrality, and rules are being developed all the time. So it's just to provide a bit of reassurance that we hear a lot about these markets, but actually they're at a very early nascent stage in their development. And that's why, whilst it might be frustrating, there will be an element of you will need professional advice because of your specific context, because the rules are just developing literally every few months. There's new guidance, there's new clarity on things like tax position, what happens at the end of the agreement. All these things are still being ironed out. So you're kind of ahead of the curve in some respects. You're here, you're getting an early feel for what's coming down the line. And this year we're expecting to see a lot of activity in this space. So the context really from what we're finding is that we're seeing a whole boost of interest in these agreements, not purely, but one of the driving factors is the agricultural transition. So particularly the phase out of BPS is going to drive a lot of structural change in the sector during a time when these new markets are really ramping up. And so members are looking at us at the NFU and saying, well, actually, how do I get involved? What's the opportunity here for me to diversify my income and mitigate some of those impacts I'm going to have from losing key income streams like BPS going forward? But these markets in carbon, biodiversity and water are in their early stages of development, but they're showing growing momentum. There's a lot of money being poured into trying to figure out how these markets are going to work and apply and be delivered. Also by the government, because they almost need these markets to work if they want to deliver on their environmental ambitions and their statutory obligations. If they're structured correctly, these markets can provide an attractive source of diversified income for agricultural businesses, but actually if not, they carry significant risks with intergenerational implications. And the reason I say intergenerational implications is because a lot of these nature agreements are multi-decade long-term agreements. If you're getting involved in these, they're not generally for the short term. We're not talking, for the most part, about 5-year, 6-year agreements. These generally tend to be, especially the higher integrity ones with the strong kind of framework around them, tend to be going into multiple decades, some even spanning into 80 plus years, you know, when you start getting into the water space. So what we did at the NFU is we worked with a whole load of our policy experts across the board who specialise in tenancies, tax, looking at nature, environment, climate change, the legal team, and we identified 5 key principles which, if met, could help shape the development of environmental markets that are suitable for the agricultural sector to engage in. Now, what I'm going to do is kind of use these 5 principles, talk through them a bit, but try to apply them a bit in the BNG context. But hopefully, I thought it was useful for you to see the broad principles, because you can think through these whenever you're being approached about carbon markets or water opportunities or biodiversity net gain. So let's start with principle 1. Environmental markets must work alongside the domestic production of food, energy and fibre. The key point to really make here is there will always be a degree of trade-off, essentially, because you are changing your land management regime. And effectively, whether you're putting in woodland or looking at habitat creation or looking at species-rich grassland or whatever it might be, there will generally be some trade-offs with agricultural production capacity on that farm, unless you have very low productive land that you're like, well, actually, I can put that to better use. And there's not that clear trade-off. But generally, you know, it might even be just lower yields off that land, even if you are able to graze it or, you know, cut it. And BNG does allow for some of that. That's one of its kind of unique strengths against certain other projects, such as the woodland carbon codes, or where you're doing woodland plantations, where generally woodland creation in line with those carbon code projects needs to be of a larger scale and have more stringent requirements in terms of what you need to deliver. And because of the transaction cost, you generally need more scale around those interventions. With BNG, you can get involved in things like pond restoration, looking at grassland options, which can work alongside your farming system. But it is important to note there are trade-offs. And one of the key things to bear in mind here is that at the moment, it's not entirely clear what happens at the end of that 30-year agreement. So we hear about the 30 years, that you will have to have that agreement in place. But the general consensus at this point is actually that land will probably stay within the form of that habitat that you've created. It will be very difficult to reverse that back to what it was prior to you entering the agreement. So whilst we might look at some of these, for example, unit costs and think, well, actually the price seems really attractive, you do have to kind of think, well, actually that price is for long-term land use change, and effectively you trading off your control over certain management decisions you might want to make with that land. It's not to say that works for some farmers and landowners. That will work because it's part of your overall vision in terms of what you want to do with your land. You might want to create nature on your land. You might think it's a good investment in improving soil health, on diversifying into a tourism enterprise, and it supports with some of those things, or just demonstrating your green credentials, for example, for your business. So there's loads of motivations for doing it, but generally what we find is the financial motivations alone aren't enough at the moment with a lot of these agreements. It has to be a broader philosophy to do with how you're managing your farm. So that's always one just to be aware of. Next principle is that public policy and government initiatives must support the development of private markets. At the moment, there's a lot of confusion about how these schemes will interact. You know, how does a carbon scheme and a water scheme and a biodiversity scheme all interact? If a farmer's delivering biodiversity on their land, that will have water and carbon benefits, but you often can't monetize those benefits because it's not clear how you'd stack and sell those benefits to different people who are interested in them. And this is really evolving quickly. We're doing a lot of work with government to say, look, we need more clarity on how SFI and ELMS and public payment schemes will work alongside these private sector agreements. With BNG, we're starting to get some of that clarity, as we've already discussed earlier on, which is really helpful. Some of that is less clear when it comes to other markets, such as carbon and water at this stage. Also with BNG, we're starting to get some clarity from government on how nutrient offsetting could work alongside Biodiversity Net Gain, and there's some possibility to stack there. So we are starting to get some clarity in that space, and that's where one of the strengths that we kind of have with BNG, that we're starting to see kind of how this might work alongside other agreements. But just to bear in mind, there is work going on with government at the moment that's been commissioned by DEFRA, looking at how private market agreements can be better stacked together, how the rules could be improved, so carbon, water, BNG agreements could work more constructively to make the economics of this more attractive to landowners. And this is what we see when we go out, you know, and speak to members, that actually the economics doesn't always stack up on its own, unless you can stack and blend different revenue streams. So we're trying to make that process easier. But if it sounds confusing at the moment, it's because in many instances it actually is, and the rules are still being drawn up and interrogated in that space as we speak. But as I said, for BNG, there is still some clarity, which is useful. You know, you can start to make decisions on farm around this, but watch this space. Principle 3, environmental markets require clear rules and standards to allow farmers and buyers to participate with confidence. So in certain areas, this is really difficult to do. So if you look at soil carbon, for example, it's very difficult to have reliable metrics on how you measure and monetize soil carbon. On hedgerows, on agroforestry, on a lot of these interventions that you can actually do on farm, it can be quite difficult to do that. The ones that kind of do exist out there that kind of have a high degree of confidence around them are generally your woodland carbon codes, your peatland codes, and now with the DEFRA metric, the biodiversity metric, Biodiversity Net Gain is getting a lot of confidence because you have an agreed metric that you can use to analyse the outcomes and what you need to deliver on farm. And that kind of does provide it with a bit more of safety compared to some of the an assurance, or a lot more assurance compared to some of the propositions out there where new tools and private sector tools are being kind of developed based on modelling, and you almost have to put a bit of faith into the integrity of the models that are being used to quantify what you're delivering on farm. At least here you have a government kind of endorsed metric that you can use to kind of quantify the impacts on farm, and get professionals to kind of have that common understanding of actually what is it as a farmer that you're selling and what is it that the buyer is buying. You know, there's more clarity around that in the BNG space. It's not to say it's kind of fully there. As I said, there are still bits that need to be worked out. This is still a very new market. It's only really fully, the statutory side of it's only coming live now next month. So there's going to be a lot of bedding in to do in this market. But there will be advantages for early adopters, but there'll also be risks potentially for early adopters because you're more exposed to some of that uncertainty and what you might, in terms of how the rules might develop over time. Markets should be accessible across a range of farm sizes, tenures and business structures. The challenge we have generally with environmental markets is that they require scale to make them economically viable. So if you look at woodland, peatland, and a lot of other private agreements, generally you need a bit of scale to make them work. And this means that small and medium-sized farms and tenanted land generally are unable to access these markets. So there's a lot of work going on trying to consider, well, actually, how do we engage farmers of all sizes beyond just your larger estates? And this is where cluster groups are going to play a really important role. It's great to work with Tim and the likes of Tim, who are doing some really positive work in this space, trying to understand how you aggregate smaller projects on farms into something that's marketable to drive more value and access more markets. But there are challenges here. Like one of the key risks we see for tenants, for example, is around the tax position. We don't actually know, or there's a lack of clarity at the moment, what the tax position of these agreements will be in terms of your APR. So how will this be treated? How will it affect any capital reliefs on that respect? The government has consulted on this, the NFU has responded and provided representation on that consultation, but the outcomes of that are still unclear. And there's a big push to government to provide more clarity around what the tax treatment of these agreements will be, because that's a huge question mark for all of you in the room that are looking to make these decisions and thinking about succession and long-term planning of your business. Principle 5 is that farmers must be fairly rewarded for the delivery of environmental goods. There is a risk attached, there's the high upfront costs of a lot of these agreements. You have to kind of invest as a farmer and or as a land manager, and you'll have risks associated with that, including cash flow risks. But the challenge here really is that because these markets are so new, it is difficult to understand where prices are going to settle. Because at the moment, we don't have a fully functioning market for biodiversity units, for example. There's a lot of pioneers in the space and project developers that are trying to define that market and bring it online. But at the moment, there's not a huge amount of operators in this space. And what it means is that you can get all sorts of ranges thrown at you for prices of biodiversity units. It can go from 11,000 to 20,000 to 40,000 to even higher. And I fully sympathise with Ben, who's trying to answer that question without setting expectations too high or too low. Because the reality is it will depend on who you're working with and what they need and where you are and how certain things like local nature recovery strategies shape up, because that will affect the demand for biodiversity delivery on your farm. So biodiversity is very location specific in terms of the value it generates, and therefore it's very difficult to provide generic prices. But one of our asks is for more transparency around this, just so there's more market visibility on what kind of prices are being agreed in the market, because that's only going to help drive fairness and trust in trades over time. And so that's something we're also working with government on to kind of figure out how do we drive transparency in this space. But in the meantime, this is why it is very important to work with seek professional advice and make sure you are very well informed before you get involved in some of these agreements. But there are advisors out there that can help you with that. We at the NFU also have for members a contract checking service where if you have agreements and you're unsure about them, you can run them through our contract checking service, and our legal team can look them through and provide you with advice. And there's a whole host of other places you can go, such as brokers, project developers, habitat banks, your local authority. He'll be working on local nature recovery strategies and trying to identify those hotspots for biodiversity delivery. These are all useful kind of channels to be engaging with to try to understand what's the potential for your farm. So I'll finish on this. What are the key questions that you really need to be asking yourself at this stage? So one is, does the laser work? Great. How will the proposition work within my farming business? A key part of this is also trying to understand actually what might your future commitments be on your farm, to your supply chain, your regulatory commitments. Will you need some of that land to kind of offset some of your emissions? Will you need some of that land to deliver biodiversity to meet supply chain requirements or whatever, depending on the market you're going into? And it's worth stress testing your business to kind of say, well, actually, on my land, how much can I put towards these projects and still have scope for me to meet any potential commitments I might have on my own business in the future? And that's really difficult to do. We hear from members all the time, how do we know what that's perfect? How do we know? How can we crystal ball gaze on what's going to happen? And we can't really answer that because of all the uncertainty. So it really is about just doing a bit of scenario testing to kind of understand what scope do you have and what will it mean if you enter certain agreements? Will you be able to count that towards your own, for example, green credentials on production or that kind of thing? Who owns the environmental offset? Are you getting the value from the trade? Who's getting the value from the trade of that offset? Are you delivering the project and then just being paid for delivering the project, or are you actually getting the credit to trade in the market? This goes more broadly than BNG, but looking at carbon or water or whatever it might be, it's important to really understand who's got the rights over the environmental outcome that's being generated. There's all sorts of agreements that are coming out. As some pay you as a farmer to deliver the actions, but the credit actually goes to the broker. They sell it for a value and you get a proportion of whatever they sell it for. So there's different models out there, and you just need to be very clear on actually what your rights are in that agreement. How long will the project last, and what are your rights at the end of the agreement? Again, there's question marks around this, but if it's not clear, then there will probably need to be an assumption that you'll have limited ability to revert that land back to what it was before. And so you need to really factor that in when you're costing the attractiveness of the payment rates, you know, the high payment rates at the beginning. How will I demonstrate environmental benefits? What's the tools and the codes that are being used? So in this case, we have the metric tool, which provides a common understanding, which is useful. How will this work alongside ELMS and my broader environmental commitments? And we've kind of explored that already. How is a payment rate and payment structure determined? Will it provide suitable returns? So it's very important to ask that question about why is the value what it is that you're being offered. Who is buying the offsets and how are my payments assured? For some of you, it will be important to know who's buying these at the other end of the agreement. It can really affect the credibility of the agreement. It could affect the challenge the agreement could get from, you know, society in the future, depending on who's buying these offsets. So, but again, there's a very clear purpose for them in the case of statutory BNG credits, because it's for developments. And what are the tax implications? Hopefully one day we'll be able to answer that with a lot of confidence, but not today, sorry. But thank you. Happy to take any questions at that point.
Thank you, Rohit. Very interesting. I mean, that is a can of worms. But if we've got a couple of questions, it would be great to hear before we go on to a couple of people that actually done it on the ground, to hear from them. We've had one question already. We'll come back if there are no others, but there's someone at the back of the room. Don't forget your question, because we'll have it in the panel discussion. We'll bank that.
My name's Kip Badding. I was in Red Tractor. I'm no longer in Red Tractor. I may not be the only one. Is anybody here still in Red Tractor? Do I see any hands? No, not at all. Has anybody been in Red Tractor and no longer so? Any hands? Oh, well, the reason I raise that is because I have a question. We've seen in Red Tractor a tendency to drift into environmental benefits, which some people may have felt was going to be imposed on them, so it's up for debate at the moment. And I hear from BNG proposals that you've put up there that we're talking about a similar thing. Our concern in Red Tractor was that those in the food chain, lower down the food chain or higher up the food chain, would derive benefits from any environmental measures that those of us in Red Tractor were doing, and that we'd lose control of what was being done with the benefit. And I hear the same problem here, in that we commit to BNG project, which may have tremendous value for other people and other organizations in the food chain, and we lose contact with that value. And I think that's what you've just been saying. So how do we retain or know with confidence that what we commit to for 30 years with an upfront one-off payment will keep us in touch with what the value of this work is further down the road to the people selling the products? Because remember, we are food producers. Thank you.
That's a very good question.
Thank you. Yeah, not an easy one, but thank you. Well, I guess this is ultimately where, if that's important to you in terms of the ongoing value and the benefits delivering on the ground, that's where the whole question about who is buying the offsets is really important, and your route to market is going to be really important with any environmental agreement you get into. But ultimately, yeah, it's in these markets, it's kind of at the moment seen as quite transactional. You know, it's kind of like you as a farmer will decide, well, actually, does that intervention to deliver biodiversity work on my farming system? And am I making a return from that that kind of works for me? to diversify my income, to kind of support the rest of my farming system, or to achieve some other broader objectives around creating an attraction for tourists or whatever it might be, recreation. But that's almost like where it stops, because once you've agreed to that agreement and you've got your payment rate in place, that's your commitment is then just to deliver that biodiversity benefit, and you're extracting the benefit from that payment that you're getting. Any further benefit that's kind of accumulated by whoever's bought that offset is for them to reap, you know. But with BNG, because there's a clear statutory function, which is actually it's unlocking development, you can see that probably quite early on in terms of visibility on where it's going, what's it unlocking in terms of development. But yeah, that's the negotiation to be had at the beginning, to make sure you are getting the true value of the agreement. But it's worth saying as well that because these markets are so complicated, there will be intermediaries. You know, everyone's got a degree of skin in the game. So whoever's delivering on the ground has a lot of skin in the game. But the brokers, the advisors, all also have skin in the game in terms of delivery risk and commitments they'll have on them. And therefore, there will always be an element of sharing the risk and the reward through all the intermediaries to the end buyer of that offset. You know, and it's not about, and it's about how do we just make sure that distribution is fair, and that the farmer and the landowner has visibility on how much of the end value they are realising. And that's something we're asking for, that there's more transparency around the fees and charges and margins that are being taken out of this before the farmer gets their payment. So, yeah.
If I may, on that, also always be thinking about how your farm is producing environmental benefit aside from BNG. Unless you're putting the whole farm into BNG, in which case that's fine. But there aren't going to be that many instances where that happens. But if you're just putting 5 or 10% of your least productive, hardest to farm, tightest margin land into BNG, that doesn't preclude you from thinking of an agroecological or regenerative, or call it what you like, approach across the rest of the farm, and that is where you should be going after CS or SFI payments and so on to get to where the food markets need to get you to. But it's about having 5 or 10% into BNG doesn't not mitigate all your obligations on the rest of the farm. So the gentleman at the table there, and then still got your hand up.
Charles Pears, a farm just down the road. I suppose I'm a cynic, but I think I understand the workings, but before one got involved, who actually pays? I'm thinking now of a development, a big development, say, just down the road here, and they approach us for doing it in some form of BNG, and it works, whatever. Who pays? Does the developer pay the farmer? What guarantee is there, because it's a payment for 30 years, if he goes bankrupt, what the hell happens then? Who's going to pay? I don't trust developers. Are they able to wiggle out of a situation? Are payments index linked? I'm sure a lot of these things you can't answer yet, and I realise why, but it's very difficult one to sort of understand where you go and who's going to pay, because you could alter your system of farming.
We'll let Rohit answer his perspectives on that, but I'm sure To and I have perspectives on that, which we'll bank for the panel discussion as well. But if you'd like to give your thoughts on,
that's more or less what I'm saying. Where the hell do we stand?
Yeah, no, that's a fair question. So I think you'll both be a better position to talk about the actual structures of how these payments are made. I mean, this is something we're looking at across environmental agreements. How do you reduce that counterparty risk of like the buyer going default? My understanding at the moment is that a lot of that money up front is locked up in an escrow account. So the funds have to be secured up front. So the default risk doesn't impact the farmer. So if the developer went bust, that money is already secured up front. It's not index linked, I don't believe, because actually it's not a payment over time. You're paid for the per unit of the credit, and that is what you're going to get, and then the rest of it is on you. And again, this is the delivery risk. You know, you have to price in, you know, the inflationary pressures you might have on maintaining that habitat over time and the creation aspect. So all.
There's lots of different models, and we'll dive into that in the panel discussion, because I think that's a really important one. But in the interest of getting the examples up and talking, we'll come back to that in the panel. But I'm not going to ignore your question again. Have you got a quick one, or do you want to save it for the panel?
I'll do that.
Thank you.
Hi, Tony Langford from Pitchcote Hill Farm. It's not too far away from here. The SFI 24, the recent announcement that they made, they said the payments were sort of shooting up for creating species-rich grassland up to about £650, £700 or something like that. Although that doesn't seem necessarily that much compared to, if I've got it right, the figures that would come through this in terms of selling habitat units. But so might farmers actually be disincentivized from going into those kind of schemes, because doesn't biodiversity net gain ultimately reward more the land that hasn't already got that diversity? So yeah, I just wonder what you thought about that. I think so. For instance, if I did go into SFI 24, one of these options, and started creating more species-rich grassland, I would then be able to effectively, I would have less of these habitat units to sell through BNG, wouldn't I? So why would I enter in? Why would I think about entering into those SFI 24 options?
Yeah, so there's a different risk return profile as well. So you know, with your the length of the agreement is completely different on a BNG unit versus say an SFI agreement, and therefore farmers that want flexibility and retain some control over management of their land will probably find SFI agreements more accessible. There's less kind of upfront costs associated. There's less professional advice you need. There's a whole load of barriers which make this more of a commitment and a longer term undertaking. The other thing to also say is that BNG is not expected to be this like huge market that every farmer is going to have access to, or land manager. It's actually quite a small market. So if you're in the right place where there is demand for these units, you may have an opportunity to tap into this. But it's not really in the gift of the farmer to fully decide and say, well, actually, I want to do this instead of SFI. It's only if the opportunity presents itself in your area because there's demand for those units. And that will depend on things like development in your area, you know, how the local planning authority is working, where habitat banks are being set up. All these kind of things play into it. So there'll be a range of factors which will affect your decision on which way you go.
Thanks, Rohit. There's a big question on market size, which we can come back to in the panel, as I keep saying. Matt, should we play the video, and then do I just click it on?
Do you want to introduce it, or should I go straight in?
Sure, shall I do that?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'd originally hoped that the landowner, who's one of the guys we work with, would be able to be here today, but instead he's not. Unfortunately, he's had to meet another obligation. But this is Julian Gold from the Hendred Estate in the Vale of the White Horse, and he's just giving a quick introduction about why he chose to go into a biodiversity net gain agreement. Again, a bit of a health warning on this. This is pre-mandatory. This is in the voluntary market stage. Yeah, what we really wanted to do was give a farmer's perspective on why he wanted to do this from the perspective of his business.
And just a few thoughts really on biodiversity net gain and how it fits into our farming system. I've spent most of my life sort of really in this industrial agriculture system that we've all been doing in the UK for the last sort of 30 or 40 years, where there's a lot of crop specialisation. We're relying on artificial inputs quite a lot. And frankly, nature has suffered. The way I look at it is the natural ecosystems we're working in, almost like our factory premises, and we've been concentrating on the production line and neglecting the factory premises. So it's obviously with things in the press like Insectageddon, and I've seen it with my own eyes, the biodiversity dropping off on the farms that I've managed over the years. I think that it's time to really make sure that we can farm and produce food efficiently, but we've also got to look after these hypothetical factory premises by doing as much as we can to try and reverse this decline in biodiversity and also try and improve it. So we're really trying to build complexity back into the farming system, but we obviously don't want to impinge on our efficient farming operations. So we're trying to find, I think biodiversity net gains, it's about trying to find areas of the farm that can be really useful for improving the biodiversity without impinging on the main food production. And also with funds now coming out of development, it means that we're not out of pocket because it's compensating us for our lost crop. So it's a bit of a win-win really. We've got another income stream with farming biodiversity as well as food crops. And we're offsetting all the degradation that's going on with development in the area.
So I'm just going to butt in really quickly here. So yeah, really a shame he couldn't come today. And I actually heard him speak on Biodiversity Net Gain about his process and going through this yesterday. And so it really stood out. He said, everything we've heard so far, to your point, it's really complicated. Loads of uncertainties and it's really complicated. But what he said is, this is what's been presented is really complicated. But for me, the farmer, it was made super easy by working with trusted partners who basically did all the complicated stuff for him. They started off with initial conversations about what he wanted to do with his land, and then essentially took that away and made it all happen. That's not to say about all the market uncertainty that you can just go into this and Tow will give you 25 grand per unit, 3 units out. That's not to say that's going to happen, but it is to say if you choose to go through the process, working through and with trusted advisors, you don't have to deal with all that complexity yourself. You can work with partners to do it.
Leading nicely onto another case study from Matthew, who's going to talk from executing a couple of BBOUT examples. Over to you.
Hello there, so I'm Matt from BBOUT, and this is really complicated. I'm going to keep it as simple as possible, not to make it sort of Jack and Jill or what have you, but I want you to take away something that you can hold on to and come back and ask questions, okay? Just one thing I want to touch on what Julian Gould said in that presentation earlier, the video. It's about farming biodiversity alongside other farming activities. It's doing the two in parallel. And I want you to visualize that doing biodiversity net gain is a bit like agriculture. You're creating a crop that has a 30-year horizon. You're not going to be harvesting that next spring or whenever. You're thinking about the outcomes in 30 years' time. But you can do that alongside other farming activities in parallel, and the two can work together. So, I've got loads of slides. I'm not going to bore you with them. I'll run through them. But what I want you to take away a couple of points on this. The first one is, we are a wildlife trust. We've done BNG. We've gone from the concept to the design to the implementation to the selling of units, so I can tell people how much we've sold units for. I can tell you the risks that we've gone through. We want to help other landowners and farmers across this county to engage in that practice. We don't want you to stop farming. What we're trying to do is recover nature across our counties. We cannot do it on our own. So we genuinely want to engage with farmers and landowners to help you in that process, because if we can get you on board with BNG, working alongside your other farming activities, that will help us indirectly, because you'll be helping to restore nature across our counties. There are lots of organisations you can work with doing BNG. You can work with people like Tow, people like ourselves, who are, we would hope to think, quite ethical in our approach, and we will share your values. There are other organisations, there's plenty of people, somebody mentioned about other people who higher up the supply chain taking money out of this. There's a lot of cost, there's a lot of professionals, there's a lot of other individuals who are trying to sell the idea of BNG to you because they know there's a big commercial prize, which is yours because it's your land. So do work with partners, but choose the right ones. To reiterate as BBOUT, we will happily work with you. As somebody, well, chap's left actually, but anyway, commented earlier, I don't look like a land manager or a farmer. I'm not. I've been on my hands and knees, I've counted herbs, I've been through floodplains, but I know nothing about farming. But within our wildlife trust, I know some of the commercial operation elements. We have ecologists, we've got land managers, we've got reserves officers, we've got Russell from our consultancy. We can offer advice in any area that you require, and we will give you that support because we want to engage with you in this process. So I'm just going to briefly run through a couple of case studies we've done. The slides will be shared, so you don't need to read everything, but I'm going to keep it as brief as possible, otherwise Tim will be throwing me off stage in a second, okay? So we're going to skip through that. If I was with you as a landowner talking about a 100-acre site or 100 hectares or what have you, you've got to identify if that site is suitable for doing BNG. And for that, the three things you would look at are the three things that we would look at and do. One is strategic location. If that piece of land in your farm is critical for some other aspect of the farm, say you do entertainment on the site or tourism or what have you, and you can't, and that has to have public access, you can't do BNG. If that site is required for access to other areas, you can't do BNG. But if it's a poor area of the site that's not that great, that has limited value, you can use it potentially. Size and condition is important. You can't do this on really small pieces of land. There's an economies of scale here. What's the question? Somebody asked me earlier, what's the smallest site that you can do BNG on? Well, technically you can do it on an acre, but in realistic terms, you've got to have a certain size and condition to make it a viable business. You're all businessmen. You're farmers and landowners, but you're businessmen. BNG is a potential diversification of your income stream. So size and condition is important to make this a commercial venture, which then links into the current use and value. Julian yesterday in the presentation talks about the opportunity lost. There are opportunity gains for BNG, but you've got to consider if you take that area of land out of production for arable, dairy, whatever you do on that site, for 30 years, what is the opportunity cost? What do you lose by committing to something for 30 years? So you've got to think about the current use and the value of that land and weigh the benefits and the risks against doing something like BNG. This is exactly what we do. So in this example, we look at it from a different perspective. So for us, strategic location, these are some of our reserves. We had access to this site. That is strategically important for us because it means that our land management across that site and the connectivity of biodiversity and nature across the area is perfect for us. In terms of size and condition, this is about a 30-odd hectare field, well, 3 fields or what have you. We're not doing BNG across the whole of the site. We're doing it across a part of the site because not all of it is suitable. Current use and value, it was currently a commercially grey site. It had limited commercial value to the landowner, but for us, in doing BNG and nature recovery for our site, it all added together. So what we would do, looking at your example of the 100 acres, without spending any money, somebody who knows about land management and ecology can walk across that site and do an initial estimation, say, yes, this site has got potential. So in terms of whether your land that's in SFI, are you taking away potential future value, somebody walking across your land can give you that advice. And that could be one of our reserves officers or what have you, who can give you that advice. Well, the next stage is you can tell if a site has some degree of viability, but you've got to really quantify this. In the same way, if you're growing a crop, you need to know the value of the input fertilizer, the treatments, as well as the output of the crop you're delivering. So you have to do a baseline assessment. Anybody in this room could do a baseline assessment on any site, whether it's a golf course or whether it's a wheat crop field or what have you. And for that, you need an ecologist to go out and put data into this metric. We talk about this DEFRA. It's a big old spreadsheet. It's nothing clever, to be honest, but it evaluates what the baseline of that site is. And the baseline of that site may not be obvious. If you look at an arable field before it's cropped, what is the value? But with biodiversity, it's not as easy to quantify. You need an expert or somebody with a qualification in ecology to go across that and do a baseline assessment for that site. It's not a huge cost. You can do it and you don't need to take action. But what this gives you, it gives you in a filled-in DEFRA. The filled-in DEFRA will tell you two things. One, what does your land currently have? And two, what potentially could your land have? The difference between those two is the biodiversity net gain, and it's measured in units. And in this little example, you can't really see it. The baseline was 124 units. The outcome was 242. So in theory, that creates you 118 units. So the ecologist by walking across your land and said, you can generate 118 biodiversity net gain units from that site. How much is that worth is hard to say, because you've got to sell that unit. And in the exact same way, if you were growing wheat on your field, you sow that winter wheat. You can sell that crop before you harvest it. You can pre-sell it, of course. And you then have to judge, what's the value to me of selling it today before I harvest it next season or what have you. Conversely, you can wait until it's mature, you crop it, you know the condition, the volume, the value, etc. But then you're in an open market and you want to sell it there and then. It's exactly the same with biodiversity. This is 118 uplift. You can sell those 118 units before you've done any work. You sell them what's called pre-enhanced. But a bit like forward selling of a crop, that has a lower value than if you actually wait until you establish that crop or that biodiversity. But doing a baseline assessment is something you can do on your land at a relatively low cost, and it will give you an indicative figure of what can be achieved. What we would then do, or what you would then do, is we would then look at what that plan is. So if it goes from, say, modified, say it's a heavily grazed pasture that you're doing, and you think it can become a nice quality grassland, you then have to work out a plan of how you'll deliver that. Now, obviously, you stop grazing or you limit the grazing. You put in some new fencing. You maybe have to do some weed control. You have to look at all the different aspects of what you have to do, and you have to think about how much that is going to cost. Because you don't do it once. You've got to maintain this for 30 years. So fencing, you may have to do once every 10 years. If it's a floodplain, you might be doing it once every 5 years. You have to work out what those costs are. And so for us, we have our land management teams who do that, and they come up with some figures. When I generally come in is I look at our costs and I look at our predictions. I'm on 0 minutes. Oh my goodness.
-2, I've been holding it
-2,
here.
oh my goodness me. And I can give an income and expenditure outcome. So we can look at that and say, is it a viable business for us? And in the same way we can know if it's a viable business unit for us on doing BNG on our land, we can do the same for you. I've got loads more slides, so I'm just going to skip through them because there's no point.
We'll do it in the panel discussion.
The main thing is there'll be loads of questions at the panel. We will not be able to answer them all. But take away from this that we can help you in the process. If you have questions specifically about your site or wherever it is, we are a resource you can talk to, as is TOE. Talk to me, talk to Russell, talk to our organisation. We just want to help you in the process because it helps restore nature, okay? Thank you.
Brilliant. Sorry, Matthew, to beat you off. You didn't say I was going to. Right, panel. Don't sit down. Oh. Well, don't sit there. You've got to go sit there now. Karen and Rohit, if you'd like to come back up. I've been scribbling down a few points and starters for 10 that we'll try and whistle through before we go back to the floor. So, simple explanation for BNG. I'm hoping by diffusion it's starting to go in, but it is so complex to wrap it all up in 10 words. I was going to say 10 words from each, but I'm not going to do that. After 30 years, what happens? I'm not sure we've totally covered that, but I think it's really important. And it reflects slightly, it's got to fit within your farm system. Because when that money runs out, you've got to sustain that habitat because it's probably going to have some sort of clause on it, or potentially it could have some sort of clause. Any other further comments on that?
No, it is something of importance. For us as a wildlife trust, we look after our reserves in perpetuity. So for us, we get to that 30-year horizon, we will go beyond that and we will continue to improve that habitat until it gets to a natural functioning ecosystem. As a land manager or a farmer, you have to understand that you will have created a biodiverse habitat. At the end of that 30 years, you will be unlikely to reverse that and do something that works against that. You may need to think about another way you can take that beyond. It could therefore have an impact on future land values, which is something you need to consider.
And likewise, if you're an arable farmer, there's no low input native rare breeds to go and graze your beautiful floodplain meadow you just created. You might want to think how that's going to work for you. Market size, I'm going to go to Rohit, but I mean, Matt was behind with the Leverhulme Centre for Nature Recovery in Oxford. a very interesting study, and Ben and the crew, around the size of the BNG market in Oxfordshire. Not to dampen any enthusiasm, but as Rohit says, it's not an infinite supply of cash at £30,000 per unit, £100,000 a hectare. Just as an example, we've got 4,000 hectares going to landscape recovery in West Oxfordshire, down the River Evenlode. That would equate to approximately somewhere in the region of 15 to 20,000 units. There's not going to be that many units supplied in West Oxfordshire development. So it is very much a market dynamic. You know, we could flood the market. Anything else?
Yeah, no, the only thing I'd add is that we know that DEFRA effectively estimates that around 5,400 of hectares of land will be needed per year for BNG habitat creation. But assuming, say, a quarter of that is provided off-site, because a lot of that will be provided on-site by developers, so that's about 1,300 hectares of off-site land each year nationally. But obviously, it will depend on where the hotspots of development and those kind of things are.
I mean, Cherwell and so on, a lot of development, there is still opportunity. And also, this is the mandatory market. There's very likely to be some voluntary TNFD announcements and so on, other mechanisms to enable it. So don't be disheartened, but it's just this realism that there are market dynamics at play here. This is not a public subsidy that's decided in Whitehall. I've got a question for you, Rohit. What is the probability, 0 to 100, give us a percent, of the budget announcement, the next budget, covering APR, agricultural property relief?
You could have teed me up for that one. Just like land it on me. Like,
what are the chances?
Honestly, no idea, because it's no idea, to be honest. It's not one that we effectively we always hear whispers of it, and then nothing really happens on it. So yeah, I couldn't even say. Yeah,
I think I was more optimistic in September and less optimistic now. There seem to be some distractions.
Yeah, exactly.
But you know, agricultural property relief is a key one. But surely you're optimistic that it won't be affected. BNG and conservation environmental schemes as a whole, it will still be within scope of APR. Your gut feel. Well, this is not for the record.
No, I mean we're well, kind of is. It's been recorded and put it on YouTube. Yeah, so
this is not the NFU9.
Yeah, exactly. No, honestly, I wouldn't know, because we it's not me dodging it. It's the fact that we actually have a tax lead who's very close to this and probably would be the person to ask, and is looking at developments. And because it is such a live subject and there's so much going on in this space, it's really difficult to give a view that's probably now outdated. You know, I mean, we're pushing for clarity on this with government. You know, we've said you've had a consultation, you've had a response to it. We need clarity on actually how this is all going to work. But I couldn't say I've got insight onto when that clarity is going to come. So yeah, sorry.
Now let's go on to who pays, because that was a really good question. Karen, you're definitely going to have a response. We've got an approach as well. You fire first.
So who is responsible for
and index
paying
linked as well and so on, that
for
bigger question.
Your unit? It is the developer. They need to stump up the money, and they will be needing to do that really early on. So as you said, once they've paid for that and they have obtained their unit and it has been registered to them as being sold to them and therefore can be part of their planning application, they will want to pass the money on and disappear. They don't want to have any further involvement. So it doesn't matter if they go bust, the money has already been allocated and passed on. They also therefore have no further obligations, because the obligation is on the landowner to deliver according to that habitat management and monitoring plan, which has formed part of their legal agreement with either a responsible body if it's a conservation covenant, or with an LPA if it is a section 106. With regards to how does the money get to the landowner, there are very different models out there. You can do it all yourself. You can work with developers, you can do all of the paperwork, you can do the recording of sales, you can provide the LPAs or conservation covenants with all the reporting that they want, and you take that money up front and you put it in your bank account and you're very happy. Bearing in mind there may be some huge tax implications if you're taking large amounts of money up front. You can work through intermediaries who will, as Tim was saying, can pay you to do the management for the land. They take on board all of the paperwork, all of the other things, and they market and sell the units and come to arrangement with maybe a percentage of the unit price to you, plus a lease fee and a management fee. So that's another model, which again leaves you very much to kind of do your own thing and not worry too much about the rest of it, because all of the responsibility lies with the third party. Or you could work with brokers, and they work in different ways. The way that TOW works is that we would do various parts of the sort of implementation, and that can be all of it or some of it, depending on whether you want to get your own ecological advice or your own financial advice, and we can come in and help at various parts. We then work with the developers. We agree a market price based on all of that financial modelling that Matt just spoke about, working out all your costs are going to be, including monitoring, legal, risk, inflation. That's built into our financial monitoring that we modelling that we would do. The developer pays the money to TOW, and then we agree a payment schedule with the farmer. So if you want annual payments, absolutely. If you want to cover all of your capital costs to start with, we can sort that out. So we always advise people to take advice from their own accountants on best ways of setting up payment schedules, but we can do that. That works very well with LPAs and other bodies because they are looking for proof of financial security. They don't want to think they've just signed a legal agreement with you to do something for 30 years. The money comes in year one and then you go bust or the money disappears. They want to know that funding is there.
There are a couple of other options as well. So you've mentioned a couple of very effective ones. The farmer group that I look after, we're setting up a special purpose vehicle for landscape recovery, and that will be attracting investment and delivering project developer as a farmer group, and the CIC will get a kickback, and each member will have a dividend from that. And then finally, conspicuous by the absence, I promise they're invited, right, Ben, is the Environment Bank, which is another model, and that is perhaps the most risk-averse one for a farmer, but definitely not the greatest yielding for a farmer. We can go into Environment Bank if there's time.
Well, that's what I was just explaining, where they would lease your land and pay you a management fee.
Let's skip on, and a couple of other points. The relationship trust point is absolutely key here. I was with someone yesterday that said it takes 7 hours for you to trust someone, 7 hours of contact with someone to trust them. And that relationship building is hugely important. And that's why I think these farmer groups that are evolving are so useful, because you can do that as a group, the hive mind working together. And leading on to that, a cluster approach to this, to de-risk it arguably, is go collectively, get some funding, go and baseline. So we got a quote from BBOUT yesterday to go and baseline our 4,000 hectares. Likewise, on the Windrush, we did it with the Open University through FIPL funding. Use the funds out there to go and de-risk it by getting all that baseline done, get the work done. And then if you're not in a cluster, there are other means like the LNRS, the local nature recovery strategies and so on, which will all feed into the right places for the right thing. Should we go to the floor, because there were a couple of questions? Have you still got your question?
You've pretty well touched. But I'll sum the questions up, really. Yeah, where do you start to baseline? And how much, for your 100-acre block, how much is it going to cost to baseline? You know, how much should we be budgeting for? Who does it? Yeah. And is there support available? You know, should we be focusing on that rather than all worrying about all these experts that are out there in the ether at the moment? Because
let's go to.
I'm sorry, you know, it's all just going over my head, that end of it.
I haven't got the quote back yet. I could have given you an actual figure.
It's on the ground stuff we need to know.
But I like that screening idea. A walk first.
Yeah. So as an answer to your question, how do you baseline? Where do you baseline? How much does it cost, etc. We work as a wildlife trust, and if we will come along, we could potentially come to your site and for free, we will walk across your site. We won't necessarily walk 100 hectares because that's quite big. But depending on the number of habitats within that, we'd be able to spend some time with you to give you an indication of, yes, there's viability here, but you need to do a formal baseline. So therefore, how much does it cost? Within that 100 hectares, I can't say how much it would cost because it depends how many habitats there are within that area and how long it will take. As a comparison, we have our own ecologists and we have our own future consultancy nature organisation within us, which is run by Russell. We actually got our baselines checked by an external consultant just to make sure it didn't look as though we were marking our own homework. So I paid a chap to come down to one of our sites. He was there. The site itself was about 15 hectares he was looking at. He charged me to do the baseline and the work on that a couple of £1,000. But it depends on the complexity of that environment and the number of habitats. But it's not a huge amount of money. Well, it's a chunk of money, obviously, but it's not a huge amount. The advantage is once you've got that baseline, you can then potentially walk away and think about that relative to SFI, relative to other potential uses for that land. And the advantage is that if in 5 years or 10 years' time, suddenly BNG is a brilliant market and you want to get into it, if you've done a baseline in 2024, you can use the data from that baseline. As long as you haven't done anything else on that land in the intervening period, you can use that baseline to start to benchmark your BNG project.
There's an interesting additional value to getting your land surveyed. And those payment rates that recently came out. So floodplain meadow, it's over £1,000 a hectare if you've got priority habitat inventory floodplain meadow now, I believe. So, but you need to get on the priority habitat inventory, and there's lots of habitat out there that isn't. And so whilst you could be focusing on BNG assessment on your lower scoring habitats, your arable fields and improved pasture, the project we did in the Windrush was with a bunch of very experienced ecologists finding the priority habitat inventory so you could enter into the £1,000 a hectare schemes as well. So there's that, don't just necessarily get totally lens focused on BNG here. Think about the whole farm. Where are the other incomes coming from? And woodland planting and other things might not be BNG, it might be UCO, it might be something else. Sorry,
And so just to touch on that, again, choose an ecologist who will look holistically at your farm and will give you an open, honest opinion. If you invite somebody in who comes in with a BNG folder under their arm, they're literally going to give you one solution, which may not be the best outcome for you.
That's what I mean. So as the 100-hectare farmer, you know, if I budgeted my cash flow for next year for 10k to be put aside, would that be somewhere near the mark to give me a baseline?
I would say.
Would that be a sound investment?
Yes.
Is what I'm saying.
Yes.
You know.
Well, BNG survey is a lot. Should be a lot lower cost.
You know,
than that.
would I be better off investing in that baselining rather than chasing farm productivity grants for back scratches for my cows or whatever?
Personally, because I have got a BNG folder under my arm, I'd say yes, it is. Yeah. But yes, I think it's a wise investment personally.
But you know, it isn't because that baselining comes before you've got a sniff of any of the money.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, and that baselining is for you to give you some informed decisions.
Matthew makes a great point about holistic approach. Rose, we've heard from you already. Sue, I'd love to take a question. Question?
Yes. It is absolutely a question.
Fantastic.
What are you saying about me?
Nothing.
I'm Sue Roberts from Bioabundance Community Interest Company. I don't really understand the timelines with regard to your wheat and whether you sell in advance as a futures or whether you sell it later. So if you baseline your stuff, I'm also a bit alarmed by what this gentleman said about should he not improve his land because he needs to keep that low baseline. Is it the case that you can take your baseline, start improving it for nature, and then sell it as a half created BNG? Is that, I don't understand this.
Yes, so the answer is you can sell BNG at any point during those 30 years. BNG, unlike say a wheat crop, where it's a fixed amount that you will harvest at a certain time, BNG is measured by this complicated deferometric, which is a proxy. You can sell those units. If you sell those units very early, when they haven't been established, the calculator adds risk to it. It says it may not succeed, it's a difficult habitat, the temporal delay between making that, it devalues what you're doing, a bit like if you forward sell a crop, let's say. The difference on the BNG metric, though, is there is a fixed calculation within that that's dependent on every single different habitat type when the metric suggests it hits maturity. So when I showed that example with 118 units, on that example, if I don't sell anything for the first 11 years, that 118 units, which is shown in my baseline, becomes about 170 units. So if I sit tight, don't sell any units, don't do any additional work other than what I was planning to do anyway, and wait 10 years or 11 years, I can suddenly make an awful lot more money if I want. The risk, of course, is, will there be developers in 11 years who want those units? Because I can't guarantee what the future demands. At the moment, there is more demand than supply. So it's very tempting for people like me to sell units today pre-enhanced.
So you'll have done 10 years improvement
Yes.
for nature on
Well,
that
yeah,
land.
yes.
Yeah.
But I say, but it doesn't really, I'm not saying after 10 years it's suddenly all lovely as that land. The metric forecasts that it will be at that point. It's a proxy. It's a mathematical calculation. It's not saying I've walked across and identified there's 11 herbs versus 10 herbs last year. It just suggests that in year 11 suddenly it's worth a lot more. But you can sell at any time. The risk, going back to your point earlier on, your question was, do you want to invest your time and money for 10 or 11 years on that site and in the hope that you'll be able to sell it in year 11, 12, 13, or do you sell it today? And a bit like Karen's point, in certain instances, take the money today from the developer, as long as that covers the 30-year costs for your project and covers the risks and the contingencies and everything else that you have to put into that. But you can sell it at any stage.
In those 10 years, you've been accepting SFI or...
No, you can't. So this is...
Okay, then it wouldn't work. So you've got to stop that on day one.
Exactly. Let's just take a couple more questions, Rose, and a couple more, but we are now into lunch.
I'll get an answer to that question. That is fundamental to 2 or 3 of us. But we're making those decisions now. Do I go for my SFI grant? And like the gentleman back there said, I've looked at this, you can get a big grant to do things, or do I go BNG? So that question the lady asked, for me and a couple of others, is fundamental. What's the answer?
The answer, I think, is get that baseline done so you know what you have now. You can then balance up what would I get from SFI, not only in financial terms, but in what it works for you. So SFI it's short term. It means you can change things. You can move out of it if you want to. So it gives you some confidence, it gives you familiarity, you know when your payments are coming, you know what you have to do. It's lower risk, potentially lower financial gain.
4 or 5 years, come out. If you then go BNG, I heard earlier that you may have to pay that SFI grant back.
I wouldn't be thinking about putting a parcel into an SFI or a CS to think about putting it into BNG down the line and paying back. That would be a very complicated way to do it.
You can have both if they're not on the same parcel. So you can have an SFI agreement. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's where you try and put them both. Yeah.
And we have exited a CS agreement in advance of doing recovery of the site to avoid the two clashing. Likewise, we had a grant for creating a watercourse. We've excluded that area from our BNG parcel because, again, it's effectively could be considered double funding. So no, the two have to be discrete.
And some of those grant schemes as well, you've got to be careful on, but ultimately baselining, get the cash from wherever you can to do it, because that will not preclude you from going to BNG. Let's pick up a couple more questions from the back, apparently. Right at the back.
David Gale, I farm about 5 miles west of Oxford. You were talking about an uplift in year 11. If you did a preemptive sale in year 1 of, say, 100 units, then you get an uplift in year 11. Does that give you more units to sell from year 11? So could you take money in year 1 for your 100 units, and then year 11 you've got more units to sell at that stage?
The answer, unfortunately, is no. The timing of when you sell those units, they have to be recorded onto the register at that time. And once you've sold that unit, you cannot do anything else with that unit of land or that specific BNG unit. What you can potentially do is, if at year 11, so say you've sold it as being neutral grassland in moderate condition, if at year 10, 15, whenever it is, you think, actually, this can be even better, I'm going to now go for good condition, you can re-baseline the site and record an additional uplift. But if you're working on the original baseline and you've sold that unit, even if it becomes fabulous later on, if you've already sold it, no, you can't. The only way you get that additional uplift is if you register it but do not sell it. But then there's a risk that at year 11, the market's different, or the habitats change or something and it's not good. You take a risk by waiting 11 years, but no, you can't resell it.
It's worth noting the value of the unit is all risk factored, so you're always incentivized almost for the lower risk option through the unit sales. Sorry, I interrupted your comeback.
You were saying that you get an uplift in the number of units. You haven't sold those units at the start, have you? Or have you sold your 100 units that the developer or whoever will get that uplift in year 11?
So the example of that site, which is a real site, we have 118 units as at day 1. I can sell 118 units day 1 and everything's fine and dandy. Alternatively, I can sell either none and wait 5-10 years, at which that 118 actually automatically lifts by about 3% a year, but there is this step change on certain habitats, but it uplifts during the year. So if I don't sell anything for the first 3 years, even though my baseline says 118 units and is recorded with the LPA at 118, after a few years, I can justifiably sell maybe 120, 130 units.
Can you sell 50 at the beginning?
I can sell 50 at the beginning, but then it also means that the balance of the another 68 units, I'll get an uplift on that, so I could sell 50. So that's what we call sort of hybrid, selling pre and post enhanced. So we will want to sell units to start with to help cash flow that project and hold some back. And that's our ideal, because we think that de-risks it, but also gets us some of the additional uplift. However, we genuinely believe that unfortunately the demand will be so great, we will be almost not forced, but demand will be such that the developers will want to buy it from us. But that means that I can sell those units at a slightly elevated price anyway. If there's not a supply out there and you need it to release the obligation for your housing development, I can say, well, what was 25 grand is now 35 grand or whatever it may be. And there is no fixed price for those units. It's whatever you can sell them for and what that developer's prepared to pay.
Let's come back to Rose's question, if that's okay. Any other? We've got a fresh question here as well. Oh my goodness, lunch. Hands keep appearing. So Rose and then gentleman at the front. And then I think we might have to wrap it up unless there's super quick questions.
Thank you. It's
Quick
a very
answers as well, please, panel.
It was mainly about the baseline, which you've largely covered. But is there some sort of backdating of baselining as well? Back to 2020 or something?
Yes, there is. Yeah. So yes. So the reason I'm saying baseline today is, in theory, if you've got a parcel of land that you've not been doing anything with at all for the last, it goes back to January 2020. So if you have a parcel of land on your site that you've not done any intervention with over the last 3 years, and you think, actually, I'm going to do BNG on that site, you can effectively record the baseline of what that habitat was 3 years back. However, you have to be able to evidence that. And the only way to evidence that is if you happen to have some records through some project you were doing of what the biodiversity was at the time, and those records are robust enough to justify that was the baseline back in January 2020.
And not take any payments from other schemes
and not
to
taking any other
improve.
payments. If you haven't got that data, it can be estimated, but with agreement with your LPA and the metric, they will just estimate that the condition assessment of that site was probably slightly better than it was because they will be a bit cautious. Secondly, you can't degrade sites, by the way. So you can't go out there and plough through something and say, oh, there's nothing there. Because again, it can be challenged.
And that's a really good point. There will be eyes looking for ploughing up. Fantastic.
But if you have got a site you haven't done anything with for the last 3 years, you can retrospectively look to see if it's viable to say, well, my baseline therefore is January 2020.
Right, quicker answers next time, please, panel, because that was a good answer, but
Mine was
let's get it
yes.
sharp.
That was quick. Yeah.
Gentlemen here, because smells are good.
It's Castle Long Crendon. Just wanted to make an observation about what's been said. We're talking about the developer paying. I think what everyone should remember is that when the developer pays you for the land, if you're selling some, he's going to knock the cost off of the 10% of improvement he's got from the price that he pays you. So it's very important to remember that actually whatever's agreed, the owner's paying, not the developer.
I'm slightly confused. I don't fully understand that
Look
question.
at the economist.
I've heard what you're saying. So a developer is looking at a parcel of land, knowing that they're going to need to deliver so many off-site units and it might cost them £50,000, so they're offering less to the person they're buying the land on. I have heard that being reported.
We've been talking about the developer paying. It's actually the landowner that's paying for all of this in that situation, not the developer. He's knocking it off what he would have given you otherwise.
If you're selling the field for development.
Yes.
If you're selling, which is the reality of the much likely procedures that will in fact be of interest to the people sitting here, I feel.
We are living in a biodiversity crisis.
I'm not saying
Can we do?
I said more likely. You know, the thing is that we have to focus on the reality, and that is that actually it's between you and the developer, and you're paying, not the developer paying. Sorry?
You don't have to sell the land.
That's basically, free market dynamics on that one.
I'm sorry, but that's if you've got land that's worth 2 million an acre, and you've got to spend $250,000 an acre on it, then the developer's going to pay you 1 3/4 million, not 2. It's absolutely fundamentally obvious.
No, I agree. But if you're lucky enough to be in that situation to get 2 million or 1 3/4, you're in a lot better situation than a farmer who has no chance of getting any development at all. He just gets a bit of BNG money.
But I don't follow you at all.
But you're in the lucky position to be able to have land to be developed on. Not everybody does.
If anyone does have the land to sell, they need to remember that in refocusing all of this, a great deal of what we've been told, is that actually the developer isn't paying, the landowner's paying.
You're absolutely right. If in a land sale, I think we'll pick that one up over lunch because it's probably could open up a massive can of worms about land values as well, land use. If we just final question, because I think Matt's getting twitchy. I can hear his tummy.
Yeah, these payments, from a tax point of view, are they treated as income or capital? Because obviously, there's different tax rates, and if you could change quite significantly, or would you be advised to be setting up a special vehicle, as has been suggested, and therefore paying a dividend which has potentially got a lower tax rate? Because it's all very well having these large sums of money, but if that suddenly disappears out the door to the taxman, you might as well not bother.
So my understanding, not being the tax lead at the NFU, but I know this is what we don't have a clear answer to at the moment in terms of how it's going to be treated in terms of trading income or in terms of capital. So that's where we need clarity. I don't know how it's been treated to date with existing transactions, but I know there's no consensus on this point at the moment, and this is where we need effectively a clear steer on how it should be treated.
The answer is that we don't have a clear steer. It's another one of these risks. So inevitably, we are, as a wildlife trust, We are taking income, we are putting it into our designated reserves, and we are applying that against future costs and management of those sites. Now, it's down to our auditors who will have to explain the best way of managing that income and expenditure to minimise our tax exposure. And we don't honestly know what the guidelines or rules are for that at this stage.
We have all been throwing a lot of headspace at this, and our landscape recovery project, a fifth of our budget went to 39 Essex Chambers, the bar, with 3 barristers working on it, scratching their heads. There will be an answer, and we are structuring the entire of our landscape recovery project, which will be pushing out funds through this mechanism to optimise that, but we don't have the answer today. So that's a really bad note to end on. Thank you so much for coming, and actually that's a really good show of hands of the number of farmers in the room. Matt, NFU, thank you very much for convening this. The panellists done a great job of trying to make it simple. Hopefully some of it diffused in. And, but most of all, thank you again to all of you for some really insightful questions, good challenges. This is not a straightforward process. There will be advice available, information available, but ultimately just go out there, baseline is my take-home message, because if you'll regret it if you don't, is my feeling. But thank you very much, and have an enjoyable lunch.